Hello, everyone. Welcome to SG Explain. And of course, my name is Willie. And on my left,
I'm Rovek, and thank you for joining us on our very first show. Um, for those who are wondering what we're doing here today, we're basically trying to figure out what makes us Singaporean by going through all the different institutions that actually make us Singaporean. So, backstory: I am a recently minted young adult. I'm about to start work soon, and I've just come back from studying overseas, and I realized there's a lot about Singapore that I still don't understand that well. And so, in order to tackle it, I've decided rather than do it just by myself, I'm actually going to do it with everyone else. And I have invited my good and much older friend Willie along to give us some experiential advice. But Willie, how old are you again?
I think we don't want to review that on screen as well. But
We'll
actually, if
we'll
you really
see.
want to find out, you can probably find out pretty easily.
Right.
That's not the topic for today, I suppose. But yes, my name is Willie. I am actually in my 30s plus, not revealing.
That's good enough to
Yeah.
be wise for
Okay.
people.
I am supposedly the older friend that Rovik has, and I'm here to share my experience and really explain some stuff in my age group as well.
Right.
And hopefully we can get some things answered. I work as an entrepreneur in the day, but my real job is a dad, and I got two kids.
Yeah, it seems like perfect situation to give me advice.
So I mean, being a dad with two kids, I think it's very, of course, housing is a very important issue that we need to address, especially to house my kids and my family.
Mhm.
So maybe today's topic, let's talk about public housing.
Yep. So let's give us some context. Do you know which was the first organization in Singapore to build public housing?
No.
It is actually, and this is really interesting. It's called the Singapore Improvement Trust, SIT, and it actually started in 1927 with not the PAP government, but actually the British colonial government.
Okay.
So this was back when Singapore was still a port city, and a lot of people either lived in shop houses that were built by Raffles and his time, where they built shop houses along the Singapore River, or in squatter settlements. And so because people were living in really bad conditions, the British colonial government decided that it wanted to create low-income housing for people to live in. But it didn't do a really good job. In its 32 years, Willie, can you guess how many units it actually built? 32 years of existence.
We're talking about
The Singapore Improvement
I
Trust.
see, the SIT. No, I'm not sure about that.
It only built 23,000 units. So in 32 years, it didn't even build 1,000 units a year.
Oh, okay.
That is really bad numbers. And so when Singapore finally became independent and the Singapore government took over, the PAP government, it realized that housing had to be one of its first priorities.
Okay.
And so the Housing and Development Board was built, and that's what we know as HDB today. So most of us actually, we say HDB without actually knowing what it means. But the
I know. Yeah.
Right. Well, you're old enough for
Of
yourself
course,
to know.
when you have to buy a HDB, you definitely know the name
That's true.
Housing Development Board, because
That's-
you have no choice but to find out what it is.
Exactly. So today we say, Willie, do you live in a HDB or not? That actually doesn't mean anything, because HDB refers to the organization itself.
Mhm.
And these estates that were built were basically a big way for people to move out of squatter settlements and into housing that actually made sense. These estates that were built, they had electricity, they had flush toilets, they had piping. These are things I take for granted today, but can you imagine back then in the 1960s? That was a big deal
I
for
see.
a lot of people.
Oh, just to interject right here, if you got any questions about public housing or you want us to address, please leave a comment so that we can take a look in this live session on Facebook, and then essentially we can just answer them along the way.
Right.
Right, back to you, Rovik.
Right. So, but a lot of people still did not move into public housing. People still wanted to stay in squatter settlements because either the costs were too high for them still, or because they just didn't want to move. It was inertia. But something tragic happened that changed all of
Oh,
it.
okay.
Were you old enough to be there?
No, but I kind of guess what it is because my parents, or rather my relatives, actually talk about it.
Right.
It's this big fire that made everybody leave their homes. They were living
Exactly.
in villages, and then essentially they all packed up and moved to HDB.
Exactly.
Something like that.
I never learned about this in school, which is very surprising. But Singapore had a huge fire called
It's true. It's true. I didn't learn about this in school. This was like hand-me-downs,
Right.
hand-me-down information from my parents, and from my relatives.
Right.
But it didn't appear in school.
It's
You're
called the
right.
Great Bukit Ho Swee Fire,
I see.
which is not as sexy as the Chicago fire or the London fire, but it's a fire Singapore has.
Sounds pretty sexy to me.
Right. Well, in
I mean,
1961.
take example. You got
Right.
Bukit,
Right.
but you get Ho and Swee.
Right.
There's like Ho is like good and Swee is like pretty.
Right. Right.
That's a pretty sexy name if you think about
perfect
it.
ingredient for
A fire,
a great
yeah,
fire
really hot.
brand.
You get-
Right. Though, Willie,
Okay.
either 2 or 4 people died in that fire,
Mhm.
and around 54 people were injured. And this happened in 1961, 25th May 1961.
Mhm.
2,800 houses were destroyed in the squatter settlements, and around 16,000 people were left homeless.
Oh wow.
So imagine this. This is Singapore, 1961. It is a bustling port. You have people just rushing around, trying to get their jobs done, and there's a great fire, and there's 16,000 people homeless.
Oh my.
And this was basically a turning point in public housing in Singapore. And what happened was that the government decided in one clean sweep to get everyone who was made homeless into public housing. So it built a series of HDB flats in the Bukit Ho Swee area and put everyone into public housing. And in that one move, it made public housing the norm rather than the exception in Singapore.
I see.
And
I
so
see.
that was a decisive moment for Singapore. But as you can imagine, because there was no one actually identified where the source of the fire was from, there was some controversy.
I see. I see.
As you can guess, with most things, with the controversial nature of such things, most people started blaming, guess who?
The government?
The government. And so
Yes,
and so everyone basically said, oh, the government must have started the fire. There is no facts backing this up. This is all rumors. And so we don't want to be in the habit of fake news, but this was a pretty interesting story we found, and a pretty important one for public housing's history in Singapore.
I see. We got a comment here from Mr. Clifford Yao. He's saying, I plan to BTO with my girlfriend soon and have no idea what to do or how to start. Any advice? Okay, Mr. Clifford, we will get to you shortly. I think
Right.
let's go through some of the material we have, and definitely we want to talk about how do we start getting that BTO with his girlfriend.
Right.
Yeah.
We have your answer more or less, but we want to get there the right way.
Okay.
So we have public housing. We have people who are moving out of squatter settlements, and the Singapore government basically decided a key part of public housing, rather than just having a place to stay, was to get people to be invested in Singapore. And so this is what started what is famously known as the home ownership scheme. So Willie, do you own your house?
Yes, I do.
What kind of house do you have?
Wait. Got to be careful here. What do you mean by own my house?
Right. So under the Singapore definition, do you have a 99-year lease on your house?
Oh, yes, I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you do actually own your house. So there are 2 kinds of housings out there. There is leasehold and freehold. What most people think of ownership is a freehold, where you basically own your house indefinitely. A leasehold basically means you own your house from a provider, normally the federal or the state government, and in this case, the Singapore government, for 99 years. So you do own your house,
Okay.
but you're basically leasing it.
Is it really owning my house? I mean, I only got it for like 99 years. It's not that I can live forever, but
Right.
does that count as ownership?
I don't know. Okay, if you ask me as a 25-year-old kid, I would say yes, but then it is also within the constraints of it. So I would not be able to say like, oh, I'm going to plan to hold this house for my great grandkids, right? That is not something I can say. If I want that, I have to get a private house, or I have to buy property elsewhere outside of Singapore. And so I think a big part of it is changing the language. It kind of surprised me, because when it first happened in 2016, I think was when the news started coming out about this 99-year lease being a big issue. I realized for the first time that I had always thought that owning a house meant owning a house indefinitely.
I see.
Right. So
How do you feel right now? I mean, about the fact that it's going to be for yourself for only 99 years.
like I said, it's changing the way you see things, right? So if I thought that the wealth I was going to pass on to my kids was going to be in the form of my house, that's not going to be the case anymore. But as Singaporeans, we have access to a global market, and so property doesn't just have to be in Singapore.
Okay.
So you just kind of changed the idea. And we're actually going to talk about that later on,
Okay.
about what it means in terms of the wealth aspect of owning a house.
Okay.
Right. So home ownership, the Singapore government allowed people to use their CPF, the Central Provident Fund, which is a savings fund in Singapore. And that basically changed the game. So now people weren't just having a house as somewhere to live, but they were also having somewhere where they could gain wealth through the appreciation of the house.
Okay.
So
talking about appreciation of the house, I mean, if you say that they could have some wealth from the appreciation of the house, you are essentially talking about the house being a form of investment or asset appreciation. And then now we're talking about ownership. We only have it for 99 years.
Right.
I mean, housing, I mean, public housing as a form of investment, I think that rhetoric has kind of changed, don't you think so, over the years?
Right. That's a really good point.
I'm looking at one of our articles. I just popped out, just trying to find, apparently from 99.co.
Right.
It's talking about, is your asset or HDB flat an asset or liability? I think there's some discussion about whether our HDBs are considered assets right now.
Right.
Especially since right now we're looking at the property prices actually cooling, and it's not really appreciating in such a way that it's almost like an investment.
Yeah.
So is it turning into a liability? I mean,
the way I think about it is that we are probably the first generation in a long time in Singapore's very young history to actually see the fulfillment of the 99-year lease. So our grandparents or parents' generation, some of them, they got the lease and they never actually had to think about it. And so, yes, for the first time, there is an endpoint to this timeline that we're seeing. And so, yeah, it is an asset if, for example, Willie, you got a BTO, right? So your house, I'm no financial advisor, but I think it's an asset. But if you have a lease that is going to end in the next 20 years, unless you are renting it very vigorously or you're actually just living in it and enjoying the actual lease itself, I don't know. It would be more mixed in terms of whether it's an asset or
I totally agree. I mean, I think an investment will really depend on the period of when you own the property. For example, if you buy a brand new BTO, that's going to be like, if you sell it in the next 20 years, you're probably going to get the same price on appreciated price. If you got 20 years left, like you said, it's just going to be really, you're just going to run it down all the way to zero, right?
Right. And I think that's a big conversation that Singaporeans are having, that the government is trying to figure out, that journalists they don't even know where the answer lies, because that is not a conversation that has been had explicitly yet.
Of course.
Right. And so a lot of people are rethinking housing in Singapore. And so that's kind of why this conversation makes a lot of sense, because I don't know whether I should BTO, right? As someone, so I don't even have a girlfriend. I haven't even thought about it. But if I was to think about housing, do I rent? Do I purchase? Do I go all the way to an
Speaking
executive
of that,
condo?
I mean, you lived in, or you studied in the US. I
Right.
mean, what have you observed about housing in the US, and what are people's attitudes towards housing, or even if do we have public housing as well?
Right. So I can speak for young people, Willie.
Okay.
But young people, what we do is that right after college, in the US and the UK, people rent, right?
Okay.
And I think there's a number of reasons for it, and that's pretty important. The first is that because a lot of people, when they work, they don't work near their homes. So a lot of my friends, for example, they may come from places like a small town in Indiana, or maybe a town in Birmingham or something, and they want to work in the cities. They want to work in London, they want to work in Chicago. And because of that, they rent, because it makes a lot of sense. They're only there for a short time, but it also changes the way people live.
Okay.
So you don't actually think about wealth collection or wealth management all the way until maybe you're 30,
Okay.
right? For the time being, it's about just being exposed to living in the city, living with your friends, and making money. But over here in Singapore, it becomes a priority the moment you are working, right? You don't have time to think too much about just living a good life. You already have to think about, I should get my assets in order. I need to start thinking about how to manage my CPF. And so there's a lot of stress on me as a young kid, because I don't have to deal with things. I have to deal with a separate case of things from my friends in the US and the UK.
You see, but I mean, a cool topic to talk about would be if your friends in the UK and the US are thinking about renting and living near their workplaces, I mean, why can't, I mean, how about the Singapore attitude about renting as well as living near the workplaces?
So that's very interesting. I already have two friends who've told me that they've lived with their parents and they love their parents, they love their families. They've lived with their family for 2 years, but instead, and they're not thinking of getting married anytime soon, but they're starting to rent. And the reason for it is because renting is actually becoming affordable, and it actually makes more sense. So because our wages are increasing, because millennials' attitudes are very much in favor of trying new things and having as many shopping experiences as possible. I have friends who basically live near where they work. I have friends who live in Outram, and guess what? It costs almost as much to rent a condo as it costs to rent a HDB in Outram.
I see.
And so that changes the game, because then at that point, do you really need to own?
Okay, I see. So why not own? I mean,
it's wealth.
Why rent?
It's all about wealth. So you're thinking about spending versus investment.
Okay.
Right. And so when you think of housing as investment, then it's going to be a very different question. And at that point, that's why people are doing BTOs and all this kind of stuff, which again brings me to the question: do people in Singapore get married because they love the person, or is it because it makes sense financially? I mean, I'm sure there's an overlap. There is a sweet spot.
Okay.
But Willie, you did it as a financial reason, as well as because you were thinking way in ahead. But you were lucky enough to love the person that you were getting the BTO with.
Of course, I love my wife.
Right.
But I mean, definitely the whole thing about buying a HDB.
Right.
And I think that there's some kind of like a cultural shift right now, because you have to ballot for a HDB.
Right.
And then what happens is that you got to ballot like maybe in advance, like 5 years or something, 3 to 5 years, just to secure a place.
Right.
And that entire process, including the balloting period, and receiving your confirmation that you got this development, and then waiting for the development to happen, it's going to set you aside, like maybe, I don't know, a few years. So what is happening, I think, culturally is some change.
Right.
Where people are asking their girlfriends to say, hey, you want to get a HDB with me? HDB, I might.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You don't even propose anymore.
Yeah. And subsequently, people are saying that, the proposals are must-haves.
Right.
But you sort of already know that this person is going to be with you.
Right.
So it's more like, I need to find a date to propose, and the person's, I don't know whether the person's going to say yes.
Right. It's such a unique cultural part about Singapore that it's worth celebrating in some ways. It's not a bad thing necessarily. It's just something unique. Okay. Well, as in, if just being completely objective, it's just the way things are, right? If you consider the fact that we are land scarce, that Singapore is a highly pragmatic nation, and that ultimately, at the end of the day, we are influenced by government policies, right? Like a huge reason for this is because Singapore wants to encourage people to start families younger. I don't know how I feel about it, just being influenced in that direction, because,
I'm not sure about the West, but I mean, when we're studying, didn't people, like, for example, when they want to get married, was like either spur of the moment, or they really love the person before they decide.
Right.
And if the person reciprocates, then maybe you might make plans for the future.
Right.
Now we're making plans before we decide that whether we want to continue with this person as well.
Right. As an individual, I have so many views on this, that because I like to think that I would know the person that I am falling in love with, and I still want to explore that relationship long before I have to think about wealth management and future planning. I have that time to be a young person. But in Singapore, I feel like that time is much shortened. So you maybe have a runway of maximum 2 years before you have to decide, all right, it makes sense to get a BTO now because my finances are in the right place. The housing market is nice enough. And it's at that time, you kind of have to lock in. And so you're really influenced a lot by the market and the policies. Yeah.
I suppose we are a very practical bunch.
Right.
Or rather, we are sort of herded into being practical or pragmatic as well.
Right. And that's a question that I think Singaporeans need to ask. Is that something we like? Is that something that is worth thinking more about.
Mhm.
Willie, so there's something that I found that I thought would be interesting, especially for people like Clifford, which is about the different options that we have. So we've talked about BTO,
Mhm.
right? BTO is basically built to order, and it is one of the most common ways that people can basically hope to put their names down for a house. But there are actually different ways. There are different other kinds of options for people who are looking to get a different apartment from where they stay in public housing.
Sure.
So there are 5.
Okay.
Right, we'll go through them one by one. We talked about BTO, and that's buying a new flat that is built by the Housing and Development Board with a waiting period of 4 years. So
wait, this is for Clifford, right? He asked this question.
So Clifford, you have, if you know that you are ready to be moving in 4 years, then sign yourself up for a BTO. There are portals online where you can put your name down, and exactly how, that's like the kind of financial advice that would take a much longer time. So there are websites that give you the resources. Just know that your CPF and the CPF will be able, your CPF account will be able to support a portion of the cost, and the HDB has grants for you. But there are 4 others. The first is a sale or balance flats. And so these are basically surplus units from every other scheme. So your BTO scheme, your HDB buyback scheme, or your on-block scheme that basically gets put through a balloting method, which is what you were talking about. There is also design, build, and sell scheme. So that's called DBSS. And that is where a new flat is built by a private developer, but it's maintained by the HDB as public housing. And so it's some way of like subcontracting work. And so some people say that the DBSS houses are nicer or they are more unique. The jury's still out on that. People still debate. HDB houses, some people still say are the best.
I'm not sure. I think DBSS is no longer available. I'm not really entirely sure.
They are, because of the prevalence of BTOs, they're becoming less and less available.
Oh, I see.
Executive condominiums also a thing. And so this was actually something that was created during Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong's era, when he realized that the population of Singapore is becoming more and more affluent. And so he wanted to give people, especially upper middle income people, an option to have an upgrade in their housing. And so you could it's basically a new condominium built by a private developer, but it's sold under eligibility conditions similar to public housing. So basically it's more accessible for people. And after the 11th year onwards, then they're treated as fully private property. So it's a way of like getting in a public housing framework, but then switching into private property.
I see. So, and which one do you want?
I don't even know what I want, dude. I'm a 25-year-old kid. But it's good to know that there are options. I don't know how much money I'll be earning by the time I do think about housing. But just navigating this took me some time, which is in itself something to say about the fact that young people in Singapore have a lot to think about when it comes to housing.
Of course.
Another thing about housing. So do you know about the racial quota policy? Do you know what this is?
Yeah, I heard of the racial quota policy.
All right. Yeah. So which area do you live
in? Definitely. As part of our show, we have a racial quota as well.
Right.
We need one.
I'm the token Indian as always.
Minority representation in the show. Yeah.
Right. So every public housing and estate in Singapore basically is supposed to maintain a racial quota, and that's maintained through the ethnic integration policy. So I am actually the place where I stay, the housing estate, the unit is actually kept only for minorities. So no Chinese people are allowed to buy the apartment that I'm staying at.
Oh, okay.
And that's because they want to maintain the racial quota.
Are you saying that specifically that apartment that you're living in? I mean, it's not the quota of the whole building. It's that specific apartment.
So I'm not sure. That's a good question. All I know is that every time the conversation about our apartment is reached, it is only restricted to minorities.
Okay.
So Chinese applicants or people looking for housing are not allowed to apply for our apartment in terms of purchasing. So that's crazy, as someone who hasn't thought about that too much. But the whole point of it is as obvious as to avoid racial segregation and ethnic enclaves, which is a very interesting thing.
Do you think that it's really helping with integration? I mean, do you experience integration in your daily life?
So I don't know if integration is the word. I think it definitely makes me feel, I definitely notice and observe the variety of cultures and the diversity of people that are there. I don't know if I understand my neighbors any better, especially on the dimensions of their race, because of staying next to them. I mean, when I was a kid, maybe, because I did have neighbors who, during the Hungry Ghost Festival,
Okay.
right, they would go down and do their offerings, and that was something where I learned. If I lived in a neighborhood that was just completely minorities or had any absence of Chinese people, I don't know if I would ever been exposed to that.
Okay.
I don't know if that is that integration. Is that
Right. I suppose when you were talking about the fact that HDB didn't want to have to support minority enclaves, right? I think there's also some kind of a response to I suppose our ethnicity or our history as well, right?
Right. And I also wonder, so there are two follow-up questions I had to that when I read about that. The first was, what about mixed races?
Okay.
So if you are
kind of funny, yeah.
Right, if you're a Chinese Indian, then do you get to get the advantage if the minority apartment is for sale, or do you get the disadvantage?
But what are you?
Right, exactly. And it's so frustrating because we basically work along dimensions that used to be prevalent.
Wait,
but
let me pause for a second. So
Right.
if, for example, you are a Chinese male marrying an Indian lady,
right,
and your offspring will be
I would say Chinese Indian.
Chinese Indian. Is that written in your IC? Chinese Indian?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
That's a good
Right.
question.
All right.
Let's find that
maybe,
out.
Maybe somebody can help us explain in the comments if this is true, whether if your ethnicity is going to be Chinese Indian.
Right.
That'll be interesting, because I think, and would you get minority rights for housing as well?
So, I mean, this is a whole conversation and a whole episode for it by itself. But remember our recent presidential election. That was a big topic.
Oh, that's true.
Right? I think we should do an episode about it. That would be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, she is ethnically Indian. She's Indian.
I can't remember.
But of course, she grew up in the Malay environment, and therefore she's considered as the Malay president.
Right. Right. Let's do an episode about that.
All right. I think even presidential positions are also with quotas as well.
Yeah.
It's like
it's a very interesting thing to broach. There's also a Singapore permanent resident quota. So only 5% of households in every block are allowed to be owned by non-Malaysian Singapore permanent residents.
Non-Malaysian.
And the reason for that is because the government has deemed that Malaysians still have cultural similarities to Singaporeans, and so there won't be too much of a friction or too much of an override.
So if you say that you have two PRs who are Malaysians,
right,
they would just they can just buy a HDB.
They would fall under the similar guidelines as everyone else.
I see. But if you are, for example, a French PR,
right, then
or maybe
you wanted to stay in
PR.
public housing, if there was more than 5% of the block already owned by PRs, then you wouldn't be able to apply.
Oh, okay, that's great. I learned something new today.
Right.
Yeah.
So if any of my international friends come over, now I have something to tell them. But as you can imagine, with having two basically races, an ethnic race quota in a block, that there is the potential for some issues to happen.
Of course.
Have you heard of the curry scandal? Do you know about the story?
I mean, I've heard of and that people are annoyed by the smell of curry from somewhere.
Right.
I keep hearing out that.
I find it funny that this is called a scandal, because that goes to show how juicy news in Singapore gets. But this actually was a big issue in Singapore.
Okay.
So this happened.
Did it involve a man and a woman?
No.
Oh, okay.
It involved some men and some women, I guess. But basically what happened was that in a HDB block, there were two groups of neighbors. One was a Chinese family and one was an Indian family. The Chinese family was a migrant family, so they actually arrived just from China. And what happened was that they complained they were complaining between each other because the Chinese family said that they did not like the smell of Indian curry. And because they despite trying to negotiate and try to figure out how to figure things out, they never could come to a resolve. They actually had to take it to a community mediation center, which is another institution in Singapore. I feel like people don't really know about the fact that we have mediation centers in Singapore to talk about issues between people.
Oh yeah, there are.
Right. And so the Indian family would try shutting its doors and windows whenever they cook curry, but the Chinese family kept saying like the smell is too strong. And eventually the mediation center helped them come to a meeting point between those two things. And it was actually volunteered by one of the families, but the resolution is hilarious. The Chinese family basically, the Indian family basically promised to only cook curry when the Chinese family was not in the house. But can you guess what the Chinese family had to do in return?
No, I have no idea.
All the Indian family asked for was that the Chinese family try the curry. So basically what they were saying was that, look, you may not like the smell, but try it, and your views may change. So it goes to show basically how interesting the friction that can happen between two cultures within a block is like. And I mean, it's not like the rest of the world doesn't have communities that are diverse living in the same place, but because of how dense Singapore is and how pretty pronounced some of our cultures is, like Chinese culture is a very, very pronounced culture. Indian culture is a very pronounced culture. Malay culture is a very pronounced culture. It actually can lead to a very interesting, creative dynamic that is both productive, but also and sometimes very divisive.
Right. Well, just a shout out, if you guys have any issues similar to the curry scandal, please leave a comment as well. Please tell us more about your experiences living in a HDB or living in any public housing for the matter, or housing.
Right.
And I think that will be quite interesting. Maybe we can also read it off and find out more about maybe other underwear scandals and such things like that.
So we have a question here actually from Michael Lin.
How are HDBs costed and why are they so expensive?
Willie, that's a you question. That's
right.
35
right. When it comes to
plus
to money, I don't know concretely. What I know is that what I've heard in the news is that HDBs are priced to the market,
right,
which is generically to the market of all the other housings and all the other residential properties in Singapore. And of course, by that pricing and pegging to the commercial world, we will then, of course, allow market forces to determine prices of housing in general.
And the government does try to put in cooling measures. So recently they did initiate some cooling measures.
I mean, naturally, land is scarce in Singapore.
Right.
Of course, if you have more buyers at one go, you're going to, of course, jack up the price. If you allow more foreigners to buy properties within Singapore, the net gain is that maybe they'll have more investments into Singapore, but at the same time, you're going to be jacking up prices. So I think this is really a rock and a hard place sometimes. Right. Yeah.
One of the key things about housing appreciation actually is it comes from the asset enhancement scheme that we were talking about. So, so the Singapore government basically in the 1980s decided that as a way of allowing Singaporeans to improve the quality of life, they wanted to allow Singaporeans to sell the apartments that they owned, and also see the prices of the apartments increase according to the market, especially if value was added. So for example, if I bought an apartment in 1990 and the HDB basically upgraded its lift and put in new features and there was new windows put in and everything, I could, by just in pure terms of value, sell my house at a much higher rate, even independent of the market. And so my house is more valuable.
Of course.
Right. And so there is that element to it as well, because the level of asset enhancement is actually high within some of these estates. Now, that also leads to a question of like, who gets priority for these housing, right? Because that is a different scheme that is not market determined, right? You getting a lift isn't just because you paid more for it. It's actually determined by your town councils, by your local jurisdictions, and the HDB and the government.
I suppose there's a limit to how much you can appreciate your property as well. And it's got, I mean, since it's already packed to commercial prices, right?
Right.
And it's just gonna have somewhat of a limit to how much you can price a HDB.
But it does create a very high differential. So, for example, if I have a lift that goes to every floor versus a lift that only goes to one in every 5 floors, that is going to create a huge difference in how much I can sell. And that is beyond my control, because I basically bought my house and I just have to wait for the dice to roll in my favor for my local government to basically upgrade my lift.
Sure. I mean, to answer to Michael's question of why are a HDB so expensive, I don't know in relative terms whether they're expensive or not, but definitely in a land scarce area like Singapore, prices of property is going to be high, and especially if HDBs are pegged to commercial prices, they're going to follow the same phenomenon of price going up as well.
Right.
And you talked about cooling measures. I think recently we had some like second property stamp duty that came into effect, if you didn't know.
Right.
Yeah.
And, I didn't know.
Oh yeah. And of course they are jacking up people who decide to buy a second property and raising the stamp duty required to pay for those properties. That's one example in which the government controls for or cooling measures so that people don't speculate in overbuying property and jacking up prices for everybody.
Right.
I suppose the dilemma we have right now is possibly that, for example, the asset enhancement scheme is supposed to increase the property value of public housing, for example.
Sure.
And what happened is that we've come to that point where the price is really quite high for even like young couples, and possibly if in the future when you decide to buy your own place, it's going to be quite expensive, or at least you feel that it is slowly getting out of reach.
Right.
And government is recognizing that and putting cooling measures to make. But of course, the net effect of cooling measures is going to be that the price appreciation of the asset, or if you consider HDB as an asset, it's going to be somewhat cooled off. And I suppose that was our earlier question of, is HDB an asset or going to be a liability?
Right, we're verging on giving financial advice here, which is something that I'm not qualified for. And it's a very important consideration in this whole debate.
Definitely.
I have more information here.
Speaking of this, I mean, I used to live in Clementi.
Right.
Do you know that place?
I live in Clementi as well.
Okay. So I used to live in Clementi, and I remember it was in this place called Sunset Way.
Right.
I was in this block facing the river.
Right.
A nice bridge, and there's a nice playground. But it was still relatively far away from Clementi as a whole.
Right. Yeah. So what you're talking about here is basically the different kinds of living zoning arrangements that exist within Singapore's town planning.
Okay.
So this is actually very interesting. There are, as far as I could read, 3 levels of town planning that exist. So when you think about where you live, I would recommend thinking about it in 3 different ways. The first is at the town level.
Okay.
So a town is basically the biggest form of arrangement that the HDB works with. So there are, I think, around 20 to 30 towns in Singapore. I don't know the exact number. And each town basically radiates from a pretty iconic town center. So if you think about your MRT, or if you think about your like polyclinics, that is basically your town center. That's where everything radiates from. The next level is actually your neighborhood. So you have your town, and then you have your neighborhood. And your neighborhood is basically more of a mini set of blocks, and it basically starts where it radiates from a commercial center. So this is where like your wet markets may be, or your general practitioners, your GPs, and it's really more of a commercial area, so that anyone who wants to just get some quick stuff done, they don't have to go all the way to the neighborhood center or even the CBD.
Okay.
Right. And the final level is your precinct.
Okay.
So so you have your town. Your town is basically your big needs. Your neighborhood, which is basically your mini commercial needs, and then you have the precinct, which is basically more for communal exchanges. So this is like parks, or like your outdoor gyms, or like your badminton courts, right? So they basically try to create around 10 blocks, and that's a cluster. And this cluster is normally centered around some
Is
kind
that
of
precinct?
That is called a precinct.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right. And so you have a precinct, you have a neighborhood, and you have a town. So when you're looking for somewhere to live, which is what again, something I'll have to do in a few years. Then
No hurry, bro.
right, all right. I'm feeling the stress, man. Yeah, those are the 3 levels to look at. Look at where your precinct is. Does it have good communal
Wait,
exchange?
let me get this straight.
Right.
So a cluster of 10 HDB buildings.
Right.
Is
around
okay, maybe around a playground
Right.
or some amenity.
Right.
It's called a precinct.
Yes.
And then maybe more of these clusters combined together will form a
Neighborhood.
maybe about 5, I suppose.
It's actually between 2 to 9.
2 to 9. So
Right.
maybe around a wet market or some form of hawker center.
Right.
That's called a neighborhood.
A neighborhood.
All right. And maybe, for example, many different neighborhoods around, let's say, an MRT station or a mall,
Right.
or shopping center. That's called a town.
A town.
Okay, makes sense.
Exactly. And so
Right.
this is all in line with new town planning, which is a way that many cities, not just Singapore, thinks about development. But what's interesting about it is that it is very, very much designed to improve the quality of life of people living there.
How so?
Because if you think about it, you want connection and you want to be around different people.
Okay.
If you're living in somewhere that you can talk to people and you can engage, and so at the very instance that you get out of your house, you have that opportunity in your parks and your badminton courts and all this kind of stuff. At the next level, you want to be able to have the amenities to get things done. Right?
Okay.
You want to be able to buy your groceries, you want to be able to visit the doctor, and you want to be able to buy food. That's a commercial center, and that's not going to be that far as well.
Okay.
And then finally, you don't want to go all the way down to the CBD especially if something serious happens, like you get a bad cold, or you want to watch a movie, for example, right? If you want to do something more out of the ordinary, you don't have to go that far. You just have to go down to your town center.
Interesting that you put watch a movie not at the CBD. I'm not sure if I remember any movies theaters in the CBD, but at that same point, I must.
Sure, I remember going down to Orchard to watch all my
that's
movies.
Not the CBD.
I don't know what you did during your time. Sure, not the CBD, right? The city center.
That's like,
right.
the shopping streets and
right.
like Orchard Road. But I suppose, I mean, it seems like the shopping malls, I mean, all these different things that hover around the shopping malls, pretty recent development. And okay, maybe not recent for you, but
right.
It seems like it's in the last 20 years. I've seen like different shopping centers come up and
and that's because more and more estates have been converted to these new towns. So a lot of times the towns that we are more familiar with are like your Queenstown, your Toa Payoh. These are also where some of your malls are. Yeah, these were the older towns, and now you have all these new towns in like Seletar and Punggol, and these are basically new efforts to kind of hit that new idea of town.
Isn't that kind of intense? I mean, some people work there, I suppose, and their home is like stone's throw away. It's kind of like, work-life balance is going to be a challenge.
Right. So you're basically hitting on a very good point. There's this new idea called mixed-use estates, right? And so in an effort to move the pressure on the city center and the CBD, the government is trying to create more downtown areas.
I see.
So Jurong is a good example, right? Jurong actually has a lot of the big features of what the downtown area has, and they're trying to create new areas like this in the north and in the east of Singapore. And the whole idea is that people can basically, instead of going work in the city center, they can just work in these areas. I don't know how I feel about that. You're right. Work-life balance does require, in my mind at least, some kind of both mental as well as physical distance from my work and my life. If I know that my office is literally just around the corner, I don't know if I can like mentally live in peace. If you get what I'm saying.
Right, definitely.
I think another issue that's pretty interesting to talk about is the whole idea of the 99-year lease and what's going to happen to people who will find their lease expiring soon.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And I think, like I said, what's happening is that a lot of older people are realizing that...
Like me, all right?
Well, not as old as you, right? So in the Straits Times forum, actually, just this year, a retiree wrote in highlighting how a lot of senior citizens can't monetize their flats because no one wants to buy it.
Okay.
Right. And so they are at their golden years. They're trying to live their best life, and they are not able to sell their flats because people don't want to buy it, right? Or because people want to buy it at a much lower rate than what they bought it at.
Sure.
And so it's a pretty scary place to be in for a lot of people. And it goes to show how precarious housing is in Singapore, especially if you don't actually read into the policies too much.
Of course. I mean, if you consider it as an investment, like I said earlier, I'm not giving financial advice. It's going to be quite challenging if you decide, for example, this money is going to be used as your retirement fund, for example.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you want to sell it so that you could, I don't know, travel the world.
Right.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, this is definitely a social consideration or social issue to really consider.
Right.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the time when people are buying their houses, right? Because the whole idea about housing now is that it's not just somewhere where you can live. It is also but it's also now a feature in family planning. It's a feature in marriage, and because it's so conflated with so many different things, it becomes difficult for people because they want to optimize it, right? They're not able to separate these things. So because, I don't know, if you're 35 years old, for example,
almost,
right, and you are basically single, you wouldn't mind basically getting public housing, because at that point you've been living 14 years without the HDB allowing you to buy a house.
Okay.
Right. And so that kind of changes your whole game as well, right? At this point, the way you look at housing is very different, because the law in Singapore basically states that you're not allowed to access public housing unless you're married and below 35. Only if you are, you're only allowed to access public housing under 35 if you're married.
Sure.
That's what I meant to say. And only after 35, you're allowed to buy housing if you're single.
Okay.
And so that really changes the way you look at housing, because now you're basically thinking about, okay, do I have to get married if I want to get access to lower cost housing, or do I have to become super rich?
It's kind of interesting to note that the government is placing, or rather HDB is placing it, you can buy a HDB by yourself,
right,
only after you're 35.
Right.
So what does that mean? I mean, what does that mean for the individual? But if you're under 35, you must get married,
right,
to own a place.
Right.
It's like almost saying like, oh, you're 35, you're probably not gonna find someone.
Right. They're like, you've given up on yourself, and we've given up.
Yeah,
on
here's a HDB.
Right.
But you can buy the 5-room. You only could buy the 3-room flat. For
right.
example.
Right. Right. And I don't know how I feel about that, because I have a lot of friends who basically have chosen to be single, right? Or for various circumstances have decided that.
Sometimes they have no choice but to be single as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. For different circumstances. And at that point, it basically, I don't know, maybe the HDB does do a case by case basis. That would be very interesting to hear about. But the policy basically doesn't give any allowance for it. And it's these kind of things that make me wonder about the signals and the values that are embedded within these policies.
Well, I suppose if you are running a nation that really has some form of like birth issues, you don't get enough replacement rate, for example, not enough people to generate and really to make the population work out. I mean, we are living in Singapore, and our replacement rate is kind of like almost 2 point something, I suppose. We're really replacing ourselves.
Okay.
If we can't replace ourselves, we are going to be turning into a graying population, for example.
Right.
And that's going to be quite challenging.
Right.
I suppose trying to force an arm in you, or maybe trying to encourage you to procreate and have children. I mean, one of the biggest areas to suggest that is housing. Right. I suppose that may actually be just an opinion. Maybe something that that's why they're saying that maybe you should consider that.
It's a pretty strong tool. I'd admit that. I saw a joke online actually by gov.sg. I was trying to read up about public housing lifts, and they actually made this pun where they will release you from deception. Do you get it? We-lease. I was like, oh my god.
But this is from GovTech.
from gov.sg.
Oh, I see.
Right.
.sg. Okay,
Right.
that's pretty cool. And, well, that's probably the government's way of trying to connect to
Sure.
audiences such as
Sure.
yourself.
Sure.
Yeah, mildly connected over here, but not sure about your generation.
Right. Let's quickly talk about private housing
Okay.
as a contrast. So there are private housing options available for people who want to just jump into that. These are normally much more expensive. And
Okay.
they're also zoned, so you can normally think of like Bukit Timah area or maybe Upper Thompson. These places are normally the places where there's a lot of private housing. And there are four main differences.
Okay.
So in terms of getting loans for your housing, you can't get it from public loan places like the HDB. So you have to get bank loans. private
Okay,
bank
sure.
loans.
Definitely. Commercial properties, commercial solutions, right?
Right.
And those.
There's also resale restrictions. So there's a minimum occupancy if you get public housing. You're supposed to occupy your own house for maybe around 5 years, I think, before you're
Okay.
allowed to rent and stuff like that, or sell your house again. And so in private housing, you don't have to do that. There's a possibility of freehold, so you don't have to have a 99-year lease. You can hold your lease for up to indefinitely sometimes.
Okay.
And
If it's a freehold property, for example.
right. And there are grants that are not available for private housing. So one of the biggest grants that the government is trying to push is a grant if you stay close to your parents. Because
Okay.
they want to encourage multi-generational families, especially for resale flats. So, okay, this is something we forgot to mention. Another option for housing is actually resale flats. And I think Jared mentioned that.
Yes.
Thanks, Jared.
Don't forget resale flats.
Right. Resale
Thank you,
flats are
Jared.
huge. People do buy resale flats. They renovate it. It's a way of getting flats without waiting for 4 years. And a lot of times grants are available for resale flats, but they're not that available for private housing.
Okay.
So it's really a financial decision at that point when it comes to and a quality of life, I guess, if you want certain amenities and neighborhood access and stuff like that with private housing.
Definitely. Right. I mean, with all these things, I mean, how do you find the public housing? I mean, as a young person, 25, I've owned the public housing, but now
Right.
in your generation, what are the feelings you get? What are the concerns or issues you're facing when you're considering
So
public
I
housing?
have a very different set of expectations with housing, and I guess maybe that's a millennial thing because I've heard millennial topics normally revolving around this, right? So I care about a couple of things. I care about communities, right?
Okay.
And that kind of comes around from my background with realizing that it doesn't really make sense to live just in seclusion. You want to be
Okay.
able to connect. You want to be able to understand.
Okay.
And it actually goes back to this rhetoric around the kampong spirit, right? A lot of people today say like, "Oh, I wanna have a kampong spirit where I live." Do you know where the only kampongs are in Singapore? There's actually one in Singapore still.
Yeah, I heard about that actually.
Do you know where it is?
I think so, but why don't you explain?
Sure. You're giving me the opportunity
Yes,
to show
I am.
off. It's called Kampong Buangkok,
Okay.
and I've been there actually. It's very cool, and it's actually it's a way away from the main road, and you'll walk around these HDBs, and then you'll just cut in, and then all of a sudden you'll know that you're in a kampong.
Okay.
And it is a serene place. Like you walk in and you realize how different it is, and
Right.
why people are trying to get back to the spirit. I mean, of course, you can go to Ubin and you can see the more authentic kampong, but I get it. I get why people are talking about the kampong spirit, and I get why people want that sense of connection and community, because it's a very powerful feeling, especially in a place like Singapore, where it is so busy, and being alone and being just like having to carry the weight of this by yourself is a very depressing idea.
Okay.
Environmentalism, I care about the environment now. And I think that's for a number of reasons. Number one is that I'm seeing the world die, right? I've traveled and I've seen like really, really horrible landscapes. And I realize that the places that we live play a big role in that, right? We want to make sure that the places we live have the environment considered into it. And you know, from what I'm understanding, the new estates like Punggol and Sengkang, these places are trying to make the new estates more environmentally friendly.
Sure.
So it's a very interesting trend that I'm in line with.
Once again, guys, if you've got a comment, please leave it on our page. If you want to talk more about public housing, or if any questions or any comments, please leave it. We will definitely try to answer. I think we have quite a few as well. I think some of the things we already answered as well, some things we can't cover. But it's really interesting today. I mean, we talk about public housing and how the history how it came to be, like for example the SITs.
Right.
I think like for example my grandmother used to live in an SIT.
Oh, she did?
Yeah, she did definitely.
Okay.
She lived in Tiong Bahru SIT.
Right.
Right. I used to visit her back in the days. And now we're talking about young people who can, now it's transformed to HDBs, for example,
Right.
who qualifies, how
Do you know
city planning is
Do you know where the first HDB block in Singapore is?
No, where is that?
It's actually in Queenstown.
Okay.
So this is by the HDB, not the
Cool.
SIT. And let me just look for it. But it is in Clarence Lane, and it's block 134 and 135.
Cool.
Built in 1960. So if you're a history buff and you want to know where's the first HDB block,
Right.
especially if you want to show it off to your friends,
Right.
blocks 134 and 135 at Clarence Lane in Queenstown. So
Right.
the first estate in
So
Singapore.
if it's 1960s, that makes it about 58 years.
58 years old.
Wow.
So we're not that young. We're not that old. But that's history. Right? Yeah, if you guys want to know more about these topics, there are tons of resources online. Some of them difficult to navigate, which is why we did this show. The NLB actually has a lot of infopedias on it. The HDB website. I would highly recommend checking out Remember Singapore. These guys are basically hobby historians who basically collect pictures and stories, and they put them up online. And that's how I found out about all these kampong stories and stuff like that. From the financial side, yeah, there's definitely enough. There's Money Smart. There's a lot of different blogs out there that you can check out. And I'm gonna keep reading them. And if you have any additional tips, questions about housing, drop them in the comments or send us a Facebook message, and we'll try to either answer them by the next show.
Sure.
We're going to try to do this at least once a month,
Or more.
We'll try to do different topics. We're really doing this because we're just really into some of this stuff. And if you have actually right now, if you have ideas for our next topic, drop it in the comment section. We were thinking anything goes, as long as it's to do with Singapore. Some people have told us CPF. Some people have told us mental health.
Some people have told me procreation is a very big topic in tight spaces, for example.
Sure, that would get a lot of people on the show. But we just want to provide as much knowledge and in our own ways discover knowledge for ourselves. But yeah, I'm glad we did this, dude.
Yeah, that's awesome. Anyway, if you like what we've done, please share this video to everyone. And of course, if you have any more questions, just feel free to give us a comment. We'd love to talk about it. We'd love to share about it. If you've got any topics that you want to discuss in the future or would like us to talk about, please leave it in the comment section as well. Right, Rovik,
right.
I think today's topic was pretty cool. I mean, HDB is definitely something that's worth, and of course your generation, we have to put a generation divide somehow.
Right. I feel like there's a line
Yeah.
of light in between you and I.
That's
going
not
on.
racial division. No, that's
No, there's no
Right.
division between
Oh,
us.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. I hope you enjoyed this segment, guys. Till next time, see you guys. Bye.
See ya.